Hey, what's up, Speedy's Garage gang? Welcome back to Speedy's Garage. We're going to start looking at the flex fuel setup that we've been working on in our Challenger Hellcat Go Man Go. We've been working with Mike from OST Dyno on that. It's very complicated, and I'm not going to be able to tell you guys how to tune your car to run on flex fuel. It's really complex, and there's actually algebraic equations involved to determine how the timing will ramp in when the car detects ethanol in the fuel, how the fueling changes when it detects ethanol. But I will give you a couple of highlights on some things that I have picked up. So far, we had to go back and really dial in the fueling on 93 octane and get the fuel trims and the fueling and things of that nature as close as perfect as possible. Now, running larger injectors, you're never going to have it perfect. Changing weather conditions, different elevations, all of that affects the fueling and the fuel trims and how the car tries to maintain a programmed fueling table. But you can get as close as you can, and then you just have to, on flex fuel, you have to be a little bit more conservative than if you were just running a pure E85 tune where you put E85 in the tank, you test it, you know it's E85, and then you kind of go off to the races with that. With flex fuel, you just have to be a little bit more conservative and dial the timing back just a little bit to take into account any variation in what the car thinks is in the tank versus what you actually put in the tank. The nice thing about it is, that's the compromise. But the nice thing about it is now I can just roll up to a gas pump. If there's E85 and there's 3 gallons of 93 still in the tank, I just fill it up with E85 and it'll get to some level of ethanol. The car will detect that and start adding power as it deems necessary. I roll up to a pump, or I'm gonna take a long road trip. I fill it up with 93 octane. I don't have to change any tunes or do anything. And I just roll on out. So that's gonna be really, really nice to kind of be able to go back and forth between the two. I am still going to run Renegade race fuel at the track. I'm gonna go for maximum performance when I'm on the drag strip, and the Renegade race fuel is how I'm gonna get that done. I know it's a guaranteed octane of the fuel. This, you know you're getting a good, consistent quality fuel, and when I'm at the track, I don't wanna take any chances. So Renegade race fuel is still gonna be my fuel of choice at the drag strip, but on the street, I'm hoping I can get by with some E85, and especially when it's hot out, that extra volume of fluid that will be going through the injectors and into the intake will cool things down a little bit. So let's go do some testing. And yes, the shop is a mess right now. My little Rockstar cooler or refrigerator actually broke. I think it's the condenser fan, so been working on that too. Down to almost a quarter of a tank. I've loaded the flex fuel tune that Mike sent me, and I've right now just got Shell 93 octane gasoline in the car, no E85. With HP tuners, after you've applied a special patch to your tune, it gets kind of specific. You have to apply a patch and then you have to save the file, and you can't make any changes to it before you save it and load it in the car, because it'll brick the PCM, or it could. So you want to really follow your tuner's specific instructions when you're doing this. So basically you patch your tune, your 93 octane tune file, or your pump gas tune file, I guess I should say, 'cause some people get 91, boo. But you patch that, save it, and then apply the flex fuel settings to it, and there's a bunch of them, and then you load it in the car. And there's a couple of different ways tuners do it. I asked Mike to leave my air-fuel ratio gauge on the dash to where it would read in real-time fuel. So if I've got gasoline in the tank, it'll read like 14-ish. If I start getting E85 content, it'll start to richen up, and that's what you're looking for. And I wanted him to leave it that way so that I knew when it was reading ethanol. And so on this Shell gas that's in the tank right now, I'm logging with HP tuners, and surprisingly, it says it's 22% ethanol. So my onboard air fuel ratio gauge is reading like 12.5. So the more ethanol that gets in the tank, the richer it will read. And when we're full E85, it ought to cruise in the low 9s, and then at wide open throttle be probably 8 something. It takes about 30% more fuel volume. I think I've mentioned that before when you're going to run E85. And that's part of the benefit of it. It burns more fuel, but that extra volume of fuel with the alcohol or ethanol flowing through the intake cools everything down. It cools the combustion chamber down, and it increases the compression ratio of the cylinder. So you get more power in several ways, and it's about 105 octane, which I've also mentioned before. We'll call it 100 just to give it some leeway, but between 100 and 105 octane. So we're gonna go out and hit the E85 pump. I'm lucky I have several gas stations very close to the house that carry E85, and I think I mentioned before there's one brand in specific that tended to test really well, and I am going to test it today just so I know what goes in the tank, and I'm probably gonna add 5 gallons of E85 to what's in the tank now to kind of test the blending that the flex fuel tune will do. So let's get over there, see how it goes. All right, we got our sample, and after we get the tune dialed in, I probably won't really test the fuel anymore. Just while we're making sure that it's reading appropriately, I've been checking it, and we got good fuel today. You can see there it's reading right at E85, which is exactly what we want. So E85 or better. So all you do is you put a little bit of water up to this line. I think I showed you this before, and you fill the rest of it up with your fuel you're sampling. And then it has graduations at 70, 75, 80, 85, 90, 95, and 100% ethanol. And this is right on the line of E85. So now we're just gonna fire up our laptop, get our data log going, and see how fast it picks up the change in fuel. I fired up the data log and we got going, and after right about 2 minutes after starting the car, it figured out that there had been a change in fueling. And it started to kind of hunt around on the alcohol percent. Mute that. On the alcohol percent, trying to figure out what exactly was going on, and after about 4 minutes it has stabilized right about 52%, which I think is right. I'll have to do some math on it when I get home, but basically I had right at 5 gallons of fuel in the tank based on how many miles I had left on range and my miles per gallon, and I put in 5.5 gallons of about 5.5 gallons of E85. So I got to figure out what that looks like, but at 50% sounds right about right. So we'll see. And because of that 30% extra fuel volume, your fuel system really has to be up to snuff to keep up with that. So you can't just go and run ethanol or E85 on a stock car. You'll run out of something first, either fuel pump or fuel injector. If you've got a Red Eye or a Demon, they've got dual fuel pumps, or a Trackhawk. They've got dual fuel pumps in them from the factory. So really there, all you need is a bigger injector. Everybody says you need ID 1300s to run E85. Well, I've been doing some preliminary testing with this car. And remember, we got the dual pump setup. I'll link to that to the top if you guys missed that install. It's basically the same thing that a Red Eye would have. I've also got the Red Eye engine, so remember that. I've got ID 1000 injectors, and everybody was like, you're gonna run out of injector, and I thought I might, but on 93 octane, I'm only at like 45% duty cycle, and the injector pulse widths are well within range, and I thought I would have enough overhead, and Mike agreed. Mike always, he don't want you to buy a bunch of stuff or more expensive stuff than you really need, and for my car setup running, let's call it 17 pounds of boost, I've got the 272 Hellraiser pulley. We have had success with the ID 1000 injectors. Now, the reason I'm able to do that, again, is I've got dual pumps in the tank. If I only had a single pump, I would max out the fuel pump before the injectors gave up. So with those dual fuel pumps, it gave me quite a bit of overhead. And so with just the ID 1000s, I have been just fine. I actually tested the car with E85 in the tank on a pretty cold morning. It was about 35, maybe 38 degrees, and I went out and made a pretty good wide open throttle pull, and the injector duty cycle just barely tickled 90%. So the injectors are at their limits. I usually don't want to see them go over 85, but in the rare case it takes 30-degree air for me to see. It was making about 18 pounds of boost at that time, and the air charge, which is really the milligrams of oxygen flowing through the engine, were way up there. They were like 1900, which is extremely high, and the car was making a really good amount of power. So that's going to be a rare occasion that I'm wide open throttle in 30-degree air. So 90% duty cycle, I'm not really worried about that because it still is okay. They weren't 100% maxed out, so I still had just a little bit of overhead, but I usually like to see something 80-85% as the max, but we're good to go. And we did get the fueling squared away first, which everything looked great. We started off with just our 93 octane timing table, got the fueling squared away on E85, and then we moved into gradually increasing the power, and that means adding timing. There's a table for ethanol in the tune. You start adding timing to that, and in the end, conservatively, and I'm not going to tell you the amount of timing it has because I don't want to give somebody a number and then they run out and try to meet it and their car is not set up the same as mine and they have a problem. But what I will tell you is I'm able to add about 5 degrees of timing.
KA band.
Thank you. About 5 degrees of timing to the car versus 93, and what that boils down to is, I don't know, let's say it's 15 horsepower per degree of timing. Well, just with the fuel change, I picked up what, 75, maybe 70, 75 horsepower. So that's pretty impressive on fuel that will probably cost about $1.60, $1.75 a gallon. And again, because it's flex fuel, you can kind of mix in a ratio. Once you pass about 50%, I would say 50% ethanol in your fuel, you're up around 98 to 100 octane anyway. So you don't have to run full E85. Now, if you want the full benefit, obviously E85, but you can mix in ethanol and still have a ton of benefit, and the flex fuel tune will pick up on that automatically. Now we're going to make a little bit of a wide open throttle pull just to see how that looks in the data log. Make sure everything's adjusting as it's supposed to. Felt pretty good. And there's a couple of different ways that you can do this. What I'm using is what's called inferred logic. And what that means is the car uses sensors. Basically, it's using the wide bands, and it uses a couple of other things to determine where it's at in the fuel range, and based on that determines what kind of fuel is in the tank. It has tables where it knows when there's ethanol in there, what it's going to look like, and it starts to infer what the fuel is based on those tables. That's why your 93 octane tune has to be dialed in so tight, because it's using readings from the car based on that tune to know where it is. There's another way to do it, and that is to use what's known as an ethanol content sensor. And it actually plugs in at the fuel rail, and it reads the fuel as it goes into the fuel rail, and it knows, it reads and it knows how much ethanol is in the fuel, and it gives feedback directly to the computer. I used to think that was the only way to do it, to be honest, and I thought all manufacturers had some kind of ethanol content sensor in the fuel system at some point that was reading the actual fluid, the actual fuel, to know what it was. However, I've since learned that Chevy is the only one that does that. They're the only ones that use an actual ethanol content sensor. Ford, I should say the only domestic that I know of. Ford and Chrysler, SRT, they don't do that. So you can get a Chrysler 300, let's say, that's a flex fuel vehicle from the factory. You can get Ford trucks and Ford cars that are flex fuel vehicles from the factory, and they all use inferred logic to read the exhaust and other variables to know when ethanol is in the tank and how much ethanol. This car is still reading 51.5. Again, I'm going to do some math, but I think that's probably right. But because of the injectors being bigger than stock, and they, you know, you run into some scaling things where at idle with a big injector, the flow could be a little bit off. At wide open throttle, it's pretty easy to dial them in, but at all throttle ranges, you know, there's an injector scale that you have to work with to get your fuel trim set right. So you have to be, you have to give some leeway, like I mentioned earlier. And so I figure plus or minus 10%. That's usually the rule of thumb that people go by. So if the car says it's 51, it could be 41 to 61. There could be a 10% swing either way. So you want to be a little more conservative, you know, with your timing on something like that to make sure you give that buffer that's required. Now, what I'm really going to be interested in is when I start mixing 93 back in. So it's one thing to mix E85 in and watch the power.
Red light camera ahead.
Thank you. Watch the power go up. It's another when the car had E85 in it and you start mixing 93 back in. You want to be sure that it starts to pull the power back out. What you don't want to have happen is the car try to run your E85 timing when you really only have 93 octane in the tank. So I'm gonna test both ways, going up and coming back down, to make sure they both work. Again, this one's using inferred logic, and I did, reminder, ask Mike to leave my air fuel ratio gauge to where it would read actual fuel content. And so remember earlier, it was reading about 20% ethanol on regular Shell 93 octane gas. So remember, we could have a 10% variance there. I would assume it was probably somewhere around 10%. But now the car is reading right around 10 point, let's see, between, let's call it 10.8 and 11.0 on the air fuel gauge, and 51.5% ethanol is what the log is saying. So I like that. It's pretty cool that I can watch the air fuel ratio gauge go down and know the ethanol is going up. Now, a lot of people, or a lot of tuners, they may just reset the scaling on your air fuel ratio gauge so that it still reads like you're used to seeing it read. When you're cruising around, it'll read 13.5. When you're wide open throttle, it'll read 11.5 or whatever. The more ethanol I get in this car, the richer mine's going to read. It's going to read, like I said earlier, 9 something cruising around and probably 8 something at wide open throttle. But I wanted it like that so that I knew everything was working. And so I mentioned there's 2 ways to do this. One is with a sensor, one is with inferred logic. And you may ask, well, which is better? And the answer is, I don't know. If an OEM is doing it both ways, and you've got Chevy who uses a sensor, and you've got Ford and Chrysler who don't, I don't know that there really is a technically a better way. It's just one or the other. I guess the benefit to using the inferred logic, which is no sensor, I guess the benefit to that is you don't have to buy extra equipment, and you don't have to do any special wiring on the car. I've heard that the folks that came out with the sensor way of doing it, I believe they're working on either they've already developed or are working on a plug-and-play setup, and it's pretty slick. It plugs up. You got a sensor that goes on the fuel rail, and I believe they're even using the center stack out of like a Demon, where it has the high output or high octane button, and you push that button and it activates, and it uses a lot of the Demon controls. You know, if it detects knock, it will automatically drop out of high octane mode, which is a really nice safety to have. The downside is I don't think that will work on like pre-2018 cars, and it requires a few extra pieces of hardware like a body control module and the center stack. If I had a red eye, 2019-2020 red eye, I'd probably look into it at least. But I would probably try the inferred logic first and just see how I liked it, which is what I'm doing now. And so far, so good. It's done exactly what it should do. Doing some math in my head, I'm pretty sure it's right around 50% ethanol, which is 98 to 100 octane. And honestly, in a car like this, making 17 pounds of boost, I had it tuned very conservatively on 93s. Now I know I can put some E85 in the tank and have a little bit extra octane just as a safety net, especially if I'm out there getting after it. And I get the added benefit of a little more horsepower, which you can feel it. When I got on it back there, I could definitely feel the difference in the power output. So all in all, pretty good setup. And there's only a couple of tuners that I think are doing inferred logic flex fuel tune. So you want to make sure you're using someone that is experienced, very experienced in tuning something like this, because like I said, it's very complex. When I saw what all was involved, I was actually kind of surprised. You want to pick a very good tuner that is experienced at flex fuel tuning, and there's just a few of them out there. Other than that, I'm going to keep testing. I'm going to run this down, probably do a quarter of a tank, and then I'll put 5 gallons of 93 in it, and I'm going to see how fast the car picks up the change in my data log. And once we're good to go there, I'm just going to stick with my flex fuel tune for the street. I hope you enjoyed the content. Please give it a thumbs up if you did. Be sure to check us out on Instagram. It's at Speedies_garage, as well as our website, www.speediesgarage.net, and hopefully I will see you out there.